History's greatest mysteries are still waiting to be answered thousands of years later. Some of these unexplained mysteries may one day be solved with more research, while others may simply be lost forever to times past. The third and final voyage of John Cabot and his ship, the Matthew, remains one of history's truly unsolved mysteries. In 1498, he set sail across the North Atlantic with the destination of finding riches in Japan, but the events that transpired are largely unexplained. His 5-ship fleet had made it as far as Ireland despite a heavy storm, at which point one ship had to turn back. The rest continued, and the unexplained events that happened next have been lost to history, for this is the last confirmed information about Cabot's whereabouts before he vanished from all historical record. While most history experts conclude the ships must have sank somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, the location of the 4 wrecked ships remains one of history's greatest maritime mysteries. There is some debate as to if the ships even disappeared, or if John Cabot was even aboard them at all. Some historians believe Cabot successfully completed his final visit to the New World before succumbing to dangers unknown. Stranger still, there are some historical records indicating Cabot returned home after his final mysterious voyage, as evidenced by his pension, which was mysteriously paid until the year 1500. There were also letters between the Pope and various European rulers which discussed the English discoveries in the New World, and referenced maps which have now been lost to history. If these maps are found, it could at the very least solve the mystery as to how far John Cabot traveled. Ancient pyramids provide some of history's greatest mysteries. While ancient Egypt's pyramids are the most famous, they weirdly may not be the oldest or the most mysterious. In fact, there are about 20 pyramids from the ancient world in Europe, and much like the Egyptian pyramids, why they were created is an unknown mystery. The ancient Greeks were fond of writing everything down, but there's little information about the pyramids. One such ancient relic, the Pyramid of Hellinikon, dates back to 2 CE. Studies at the site have turned up no human remains or any other signs that it could have been a tomb. Scholars have suggested it might have simply been a memorial, or something more practical, such as a lookout post or a platform for smoke signals. Historians tell stories of a battle between 2 brothers over the throne of Argos. The battle ended in a draw. The pyramid was possibly built as a common tomb for the soldiers. Carved reliefs of shields once adorned the monument. The history story, if true, claimed this battle was the first time shields had been used in Greece. As with most historical mysteries, the original sources that could explain this strange story have been lost to time, as reliefs of the shields no longer exist. If it was indeed the first time shields were used in Greece, the pyramid would have been created to remember a truly ancient battle. At first, scholars thought the pyramid was created between 400 and 300 BCE, but more modern techniques have claimed the stones were quarried as early as 2720 BCE. That would make the Pyramid of Hellinikon 100 years older than the oldest pyramid in Egypt. And even if this history mystery gets solved, there's still roughly 19 other pyramids and countless other unsolved mysteries left for archaeologists to excavate and explore. During the 19th century, there were 2 illiterate Londoners who, in one of the weirdest stories in history, managed to fool some of the greatest antique experts in the country. It's a strange but true story with an unexpected ending you'll never believe is true. The story takes place in the 1840s, a time when 2 friends named Charlie Eaton and Billy Smith would make history scavenging the Thames River mudflats for items of value known as mudlarking. Some of the older and more historic items they found caught the interest of antiques dealer William Edwards. During the 1840s, there was an especially keen interest in historical artifacts that dated back to the medieval history. Edwards would pay a lot for this type of ancient artifact, but Billy and Charlie soon found there wasn't enough amazing discoveries on the banks of the Thames to meet an impossible demand. So they decided to create that supply of amazing discoveries themselves. Using images from history stories as a reference, the two men created their own archaeology discoveries. Statuettes, portable shrines, and pilgrim badges were cast out of plaster of Paris and carved by hand. Fake tokens and coins were made from lead or pewter and aged with acid or river mud. They made up various weird history stories about how the artifacts had been imported from Europe during the reign of Mary I to replicate ancient artifacts that had been destroyed in the Reformation. The strange and sometimes unnerving images of kings and knights looked more like children's drawings than an ancient engraving, but Edwards and other antique dealers bought the artifacts for hundreds of pounds. The fact that the historical artifacts were supposed to be from the 13 to 1400s and used Arabic numerals didn't change their minds that these were pieces of true history, even though Roman numerals weren't used in Britain until the 14th century. When a magazine article stated the amazing discoveries were impossible and fake, one of the artifact dealers sued. The case was solved in the magazine's favor because the dealer had not been named and therefore could not prove defamation. At the same time, the court failed to prove the artifacts as fake, and Billy and Charlie found the weird history stories behind their forgeries were taken more seriously than ever. In 1861, a politician named Charles Reed finally proved the artifacts as archaeological fakes after he bribed a sewer scavenger to break into the workshop and steal some of the molds for evidence. Remarkably, even though it was clear they had been selling fakes, Billy and Charlie weren't imprisoned, as it was hard to prove they'd actually broken any law just by selling art and making up weird, untrue history stories. The most mysterious part of this strange history story is what happened to Billy Smith later. It's recorded that Charlie passed away in 1870, but there's no record of what happened to Smith. In 1871, he was arrested for trying to sell a copy of a medieval mug, but after that, the famous forger disappeared from the historical record. The small seaside town of Pomorye in Bulgaria is home to a strange ancient unsolved mystery. A structure dubbed the Pomorye Tomb dates back to between 4 and 2 BCE and is unexplained to this day. From the outside, the tomb looks like a typical Thracian tomb. The Thracians inhabited much of Eastern Europe before the Romans incorporated the area into the Roman Empire. Like a typical Thracian tomb, the Pomorye tomb looks from the outside to be a mound, with a corridor leading from the outside to the center of the mound. It's slightly different from a typical tomb, being elliptical rather than a circular mound. But it's when explorers looked inside that they realized just how strange and unique the Pomorye tomb is. Inside looks much more like a typical Roman tomb. It's a grand circular space made from brick, with a central column that reaches up to the ceiling. On the walls are niches which likely once held urns. It's believed the walls were once painted, but only a faded green can be seen today. Not only is the mysterious structure a unique blend of cultures, it's also a very strange feature. Inside the central column was once a spiral staircase that led up to the top of the mount. Only a handful of spiral staircases dating back to the Roman period have been uncovered. When the structure was first discovered, it was assumed to be a tomb. It was likely filled with grave goods when it was first built, but was plundered in antiquity. It's possible that this was when the urns were moved or destroyed, but if that was the case, it was extremely out of place. Thracians at the time weren't building new tombs, rather using older ones. The wealthy had taken to burying their lost loved ones in stone sarcophagi as the Romans did. If the mysterious structure was created by a wealthy Thracian family for their loved ones, it would have been even more unique. Another answer to this strange mystery is that it was used as a temple or altar of some kind, possibly to a deified family member. Another theory suggests that it was used by priests to predict the future. The central column would have allowed sunlight into the area, and by interpreting that light, messages from Apollo could be uncovered. The answers to this unsolved mystery may never be known, especially if it does prove to be as unique as it seems. In the early 1800s, Theodosia Burr Alston was the daughter of former U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr. Her husband, Joseph Alston, had been elected governor of South Carolina and didn't believe it was right for him to leave the state so soon. Instead, Burr organized for a man named Dr. Timothy Green to go with Theodosia. They traveled on a small schooner called the Patriot. On January 2nd, 1813, a British patrol stopped the ship. As the Patriot had been decommissioned into a civilian vessel, it was allowed to continue. This was the last time anybody saw from the ship, and the unsolved mystery began. Joseph Alston wrote to his father-in-law asking for news on Theodosia after about a week. It was then that they realized the Patriot had disappeared. There had been a storm in the area, and at first it was assumed that the ship had been caught up in it. But this answer to the strange mystery was dismissed when no wreckage from the vessel was ever found. Soon, rumors that the Patriot had been attacked by pirates began to spread. Over the next few years, there were numerous confessions made by criminals who claimed to have been a part of a pirate crew that took down the Patriot. The weird stories throughout history varied, but in all of them, Theodosia was made to walk the plank. Burr didn't buy into the rumors, and for the rest of his life, believed his daughter had been caught in a storm. Until any trace of the Patriot is uncovered, it's likely this strange mystery will never be solved. Anyone who's ever been in a bad mood might claim to have woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Few people know this unique expression has a creepy history dating back to Roman times. Keep in mind, the scary stories you're about to hear were once considered completely acceptable scientific explanations. Throughout history, Romans believed that getting out of the right side of the bed was literally the only safe way to begin the day, without greatly displeasing the gods. In their civilization, anyone who wrote with their left hand, put their left shoe on first, or even walked into a house leading with their left foot was tempting a fate most evil. Of course, waking up on the left side of the bed, or rather the wrong side, was no exception to this rule. These ancient history stories might seem weird to us in modern times, but such myths were considered 100% fact to Romans, who believed that the left side of the body was routinely used for all things sinister. In fact, sinister is the Latin word for left. Dexter is the Latin word for right. Over the centuries, these stories from ancient history gave way to more modern urban legends. Literal demons were thought to be waiting on the left side of the bed to wrong anyone who passes by. Although the association of the left side of the bed with wrongness has gradually faded away since the fall of the Roman Empire, the common expression remains a world-famous saying to this day. As a side note, the ancient battle of Sinister and Dexter is the historic reason why, in traditional stories and folklore, there's always a devil on the left shoulder and an angel on the right. To bury the hatchet is a common phrase which in modern times means to make peace. The saying comes from the historical tradition among Native Americans in which two chiefs would come together to literally bury their hatchet, oftentimes the very same weapon that was used against each other in battle, thus ending a dark history of conflict between tribes. Exactly when the tradition of burying the hatchet began, or how widely it was actually practiced in times past, is an unknown mystery to history experts. One possible story to explain the origin of this famous expression is from a true history event in which the Native American leaders convinced 5 major nations to form an alliance. Legends of this time period tell of history's greatest Native American leaders gathering to bury their weapons under a white pine tree in celebration of their new alliance. What happened next is where Native American folklore and true history most likely blur. According to legend, when the hatchets were buried, the event caused a giant underground river to wash the weapons to a secret place far away so that they could never again cause war. 17th century European settlers documented this practice of burying the hatchet upon their arrival to North America. History stories from the French documents report that in 1644, one tribe visiting the Canadian city of Quebec wished to peacefully hurl the hatchet so far into the depths of the earth that it shall never again be seen in the future, as was their custom at the time. Similarly, a famous historical figure in Massachusetts named Samuel Sewall also wrote of an event in 1680 where he witnessed an agreement between the Mohawk tribe and English settlers, solidified by the ceremonial burial of two axes. By the 18th century, the phrase had become commonplace despite its rather dark history. Today, the expression describes successfully resolving all conflicts, large or small, even though the true history behind the phrase remains largely unknown to most people who still make use of it. "The walls have ears" is a famous expression, warning people to speak carefully because their private conversation is being monitored. This phrase may have once had a much more straightforward meaning based on a weird history story dating back thousands of years. A strange but true story of Dionysus, the ruler of Syracuse from 432 to 367 BC, tells of an unusual limestone formation below his palace. The properties of this cave formed a narrow tunnel that widened into a large cavern, a natural shape with tremendous acoustics not unlike the inner workings of the human ear. According to the Roman scholar Cicero, Dionysus constructed the limestone walls into an advanced architectural eavesdropping device called Dionysus's ear. The echoing caverns allowed him to sneak around listening to private conversations as they traveled through the tunnels from the palace's rooms above. Throughout history, the weird echo chamber was said to connect to a giant underground prison as well. In the darkest version of this story, historians suggest that the ear was not meant for eavesdropping, but rather to amplify the wails and screams of his prisoners. As with many weird stories, history repeats itself in the strangest of ways. Thousands of years later, the de' Medici family, 15th century Italian bankers and politicians, used similar spy architecture for informational gain. When the Louvre was constructed in Paris, Catherine de' Medici, the mother of the French kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, was said to have instructed builders to create acoustic ducts built into the walls of the palace. That way she could hear conversations coming from different rooms. When a visitor to this medieval palace thought the walls had ears, they meant that Catherine or one of her lackeys could be listening in from one of these alcoves. The expression "white elephant" is one of the more common phrases used to refer to a gift that is impractical. But as with many ancient expressions, there's a weird history story full of dark moments to explain the mystery behind this phrase. In the kingdom of Siam, located in modern-day Thailand, elephants were once valued for their size, power, and majesty. The most sacred of all were the rare white elephants. Said to be a good luck symbol of fertility and wisdom, the legend of Maya, mother of Buddha, once dreamt of a white elephant who presented her with a lotus flower on the eve of its magnificent birth. According to ancient legends, Siam royalty were known to make a gift of a white elephant, but according to these stories, the true purpose of such a gift was a secret punishment. Since it was forbidden to put a white elephant to work, there was no way for the recipient to make money off the creature. The elephant's new owners could never get rid of a gift from royalty, so selling it to market was absolutely not an option. The white elephant was effectively a beautiful burden that required intense care and a lifetime of resources to properly maintain. There are many strange but true history stories in which the white elephant would quickly eat its way through a small fortune, effectively ruining their owners without ever tarnishing the reputation of the person who gave the elephant. It was this nightmarish scenario that led to the phrase "white elephant" coming to mean a useless or impractical gift. Today, the common expression has evolved to include any gift regardless of intent, but historically, the unlucky recipients of these royal elephants were silently being condemned to a lifetime of poverty and struggle. To be gifted a white elephant meant a constant fear of either going poor or offending their king, sometimes even both. Anyone who has ever had to bite the bullet had no choice but to experience an unpleasant situation head-on. In 1891's The Light That Failed, written by Rudyard Kipling, one of the characters is told to "bite on the bullet, old man, and don't let them think you're afraid." It's clear that this unusual phrase is more than 150 years old, but its true origins remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. According to historical war stories, in order to quiet patients on the battlefield and to protect them from biting off their own tongues, surgeons would provide a strip of leather or fabric for surgical patients to clamp down on instead. If no such materials were available, then doctors told patients to bite down on a literal bullet while they worked to save their life. This weird story is the most widely accepted explanation for this common saying. However, there exists a lesser-known alternative explanation for this historical phrase. The 1796 Classical Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which explained the weird stories behind slang and curses throughout history, provided a helpful clue in solving the mystery behind this expression. As the history story goes, a man who cries out on the battlefield when attacked was once disgracefully called a nightingale. In comparison, those who never cried out were considered far more honorable soldiers, for no one wanted to return home with the cowardly label of being a nightingale. To avoid crying out from fear and tarnishing their reputation, those on the battlefield would sometimes literally chew on a bullet instead. Whether biting the bullet was first used by hapless surgical patients or by soldiers who wanted to appear brave while under enemy attack remains a mystery. However, it's likely that this method was, at one point in the dark history of warfare, meant to protect soldiers from screaming out during the horrors of battle, which is a morbid history story for any modern-day expression to be based upon. Albert Anastasia grew up in Italy as one of 9 children, and while working on a freighter in New York City, he and his 3 brothers decided to stay in the US, abandoning their positions to do so. In 1921, he got involved in a quarrel with a longshoreman named George Chirino, resulting in Chirino losing his life. Anastasia received the death penalty as a result, but when 4 of the prosecution's witnesses mysteriously disappeared, he won an appeal and was set free. In June of 1923, he was sent back to prison for 2 years for the illegal possession of a firearm, already making him a scary person, but what was to come would make him one of the most feared in all of New York. After becoming a leader of the International Longshoremen's Association, he befriended Giuseppe Masseria, who was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in Brooklyn, along with Joe Adonis, Charles Luciano, and Frank Costello. In 1928, he was once again on trial for ending someone's life, but the witnesses in the case either mysteriously disappeared or refused to testify against him out of fear of their own lives. But after proving his loyalty to Luciano, his notoriety would only increase as he was put in control of the syndicate's enforcement section called Murder Inc., or the Brownsville Boys. The group was made up of various hitmen who established their headquarters at Midnight Rose's candy store, owned by Louis Capone. The group of assassins operated for 10 years, and it was estimated that during that time, they were responsible for ending the lives of thousands of people. This resulted in Anastasia receiving the nicknames the Mad Hatter or Lord High Executioner. He became known in the mobster world as a man with a violent, unpredictable temper, and he was a force to be reckoned with, making many dangerous friends but also many enemies. This would ultimately prove to be his downfall in October of 1957, when 2 men entered a barber shop where he was relaxing and ended his life. We're all familiar with the infamous pirate Blackbeard, but in the Mediterranean, another corsair called Henriettas Barbarosa was considered to be one of the most feared and dreaded men on the water during the first half of the 16th century. Barbarosa and his brother, Orut, found that they had a natural talent for piracy, and they started to attack and raid Spanish ships, making massive profits that attracted the attention of the Emir of Algiers, with whom they soon joined forces. But Barbarosa wasn't content with just looting ships. He wanted to become the ruler of his own territory, and in 1516, he got his chance when the Emir asked him to aid in removing Spanish soldiers from the Peñon of Algiers. After doing so, the Emir took control of the city of Algiers, But he was soon dispatched by Arut, who ended his life by drowning him in his bathtub. Arut took control of the city, but he was soon dethroned when an attack by Spanish soldiers forced him to flee to a goat pen, where he was eventually discovered and assassinated. This gave Barbarosa his chance, and he took over. Algiers was quickly transformed into a new Ottoman district, and Barbarosa continued to conquer new territories while still raiding ships as a pirate. In 1929, Pignon of Algiers was still under Spanish control until Barbarosa decided to bombard them into submission. He then confronted their commander and promptly ended his life. He would go on to become the Admiral-in-Chief of the Ottoman fleet with over 100 ships at his disposal. He reclaimed Greek ports, raided the Italian coast, and conquered the port of Tunis. Charles V reclaimed Tunis the following year, but Barbarosa continued to raid coastlines along the Mediterranean. He eventually settled in France, but continued sending out fleets to carry out raids along the Spanish coast. In 1545, he retired to Istanbul, where, upon his passing, he was buried in the mausoleum of Barbarosa. During the 1920s, Vera Renzi became known as the Black Widow, cementing her place forever in weird history. Vera was born in Russia to a wealthy family, and as she grew older, she showed a nasty jealous streak. When she was 19 years old, she married Karl Schick, a man much older than her, and she soon gave birth to their child. One day, while Schick was at work, she became convinced that he was having an affair, and a few days later, she laced his wine with arsenic, ending his life. When she was questioned about his disappearance, she claimed that he had abandoned her and their child, and she spent some time in mourning. But to ensure that she wasn't suspected, she started rumors that he had lost his life in a car accident. Not long after, she entered into her second marriage, but this time it was a tumultuous relationship, riddled with arguments, and once again, Vera became convinced that her husband was cheating on her with another woman. It ended the same way, with her new husband also succumbing to arsenic. She once again convinced those around her that he had abandoned her, and the following year, she claimed to have received a letter from him stating that he would never return. Hereafter, she had relationships with various men, all of whom would mysteriously disappear a few weeks after meeting Vera. In each case, she had decided that they were being unfaithful, and their lives were ended with arsenic. When she was questioned about the disappearances, she would simply state that she didn't know where they were, and since they weren't married, she wasn't obliged to keep track of their comings and goings. But her downfall came when one of her suitors, a married man, was followed to her house one night by his wife. When he never made it back home, she decided to confront Vera, who simply stated that she had no idea what the woman was talking about. The man's wife decided to contact the police, who conducted a raid on Vera's house, and what they found inside chilled them to the bone. In the cellar of the house, they found 32 zinc-lined coffins surrounding a red armchair, a large candle, and a bottle of champagne. She told investigators that the coffins were being kept there for family members. But when they looked inside, they found the remains of the missing men, each in a different coffin. She was immediately arrested and she confessed to poisoning them, adding that she liked on occasion to sit in the armchair in the company of her former suitors. She was found guilty on 35 counts of murder, but during the trial, she started acting strangely, and in prison, she was often seen conversing with her deceased victims and screaming obscenities. She eventually passed away in 1960. Veto Geneves was considered a very scary person during the Prohibition era in the United States, as he was instrumental in the meteoric rise of organized crime and the mafia in particular during the 20s and 30s. In the early 1930s, he was involved in the Castellammare War, a power struggle between the mobsters controlled by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Geneves struck the first blow in the war when he was ordered by Masseria to end the life of an ally. This was done to protect 3 of Masseria's allies. However, this strategy would backfire and one of Masseria's key enforcers was executed. But soon after, Genevieve would ally with Maranzano, and they conspired to have Massaria's life ended on the condition that Maranzano ends the war. The plan was successfully carried out at a restaurant in Coney Island. Out of fear, no witnesses ever came forward, and no one was ever charged with the crime. As the war had now ended, the Italian gangs in New York were restructured into 5 families, one of which was the Geneves family. In 1834, Geneves and Ferdinand Boccia both decided to con a wealthy gambler out of $150,000 by cheating in a card game. They were successful, but after the game, Boccia demanded a cut of the money as he had introduced Genevieve to the man. But Genevieve wasn't prepared to part with any of the winnings, and instead he and 4 accomplices ended his life in a coffee shop in Brooklyn. 2 years later, Genevieve became the acting boss of the Luciano crime family. But the following year, fearing that he may be prosecuted for Boccia's murder, he fled to Italy with $75,000 in cash. After establishing a massive black market operation in Italy, he was eventually arrested when it was discovered that he was stealing from the army. He was brought back to New York to stand trial in the Boccia matter, but both the prosecution's witnesses' lives were ended and the case was dropped. In April of 1959, Genevieve was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he continued to run his crime family from within, ordering the killings of at least 3 more people. He would ultimately pass away from a heart attack in prison in 1969. Born in Germany, Gerard Puff immigrated to the US with his parents when he was 13 years old in 1927, and they settled in Milwaukee. But he soon became known as a scary person when his life of crime started at the age of 20. His first transgression was a small one, with a charge of disorderly conduct being laid against him. The following year, he was ordered to spend 3 terms of 1 to 5 years in prison for the theft of domestic animals. But while he was incarcerated, he assaulted a guard and received an additional 1 to 10 years. He was, however, released after just 4 years, and 3 years later, he was once again sent to prison, this time for 1 to 9 years for an assault that occurred during an armed robbery. After serving 3 years, he managed to escape, but was apprehended 15 days later while driving a stolen car. In 1947, he was released, and the following year, he was charged again after robbing a warehouse at Beaver Dam. He served a further 3 years in prison, after which he attempted to live a normal life, working as a truck driver, farmhand, and a machinist assistant. But he longed for a more expansive lifestyle, and he turned to crime once more. In May of 1951, he was arrested for armed robbery and booked into the Milwaukee jail on $3,000 bond. Here he met George Arthur Heroux, and soon an unknown person paid his bond and he was released. He failed to appear for his trial, and a week later, he robbed a Johnson County National Bank, fleeing with $62,000 after teaming up with Heroux. His crimes had garnered enough attention for the FBI to become involved, and he was added to the FBI's most wanted list. He was tracked to a hotel in Manhattan, where he tried to flee, ending the life of Special Agent Joseph Brock in the process. Upon his arrest, he received the death penalty, with his last words being, "Goodbye, Marshal." Up until somewhat recent history, many Americans were blissfully unaware of Alexander Hamilton's role in the building of the United States of America. He never really gained the notoriety of many other pioneers at the time, though his involvement in American history is arguably just as important. However, his story was so widely untold and disregarded that even though America may not exist without his assistance, the government had considered removing his face from the $10 bill, as they considered him to be largely unimportant and unknown. Hamilton's involvement in history was seldom understood until the very recent musical called Hamilton. The play hit Broadway and was a national success and became one of the most highly regarded Broadway performances of all time. The play tells the story and struggles of Alexander Hamilton, who was both an immigrant and an orphan born in Charleston. His mother passed away when he was very young, and Alexander eventually left his hometown to pursue his education in New York. Upon his arrival, he became a soldier and fought against the British, which ultimately led him to serving alongside George Washington himself, being one of Washington's right-hand men. After the war, Alexander's influence on Washington continued, with him strongly advising the Founding Fathers of America to pursue a strong-willed federal democracy, rather than a dictatorship or any other form of government. These efforts were extremely criticized by his peers, who insisted that a country could not succeed without some form of monarchy or tyranny. Though Alexander wrote a series of articles, now known as the Federalist Papers, which convinced the fathers to pursue a democracy, leading to America as we know it today, which could be good or bad depending on how you look at it. Though regardless, without Alexander Hamilton, there stands a good chance that America as we know it would have never existed. Henrietta Lacks was a young tobacco farmer from Virginia who grew up in a poor family with limited resources. Though when she became an adult, she moved off to Maryland to begin a new life alongside her husband. Though by January of 1951, Henrietta had been admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital due to major health issues that had suddenly onset. She was soon diagnosed with cervical cancer and passed away after just 9 months of treatment. Though what's extremely profound about her time at Johns Hopkins is that her diagnosis is what led to advances in modern medicine that were almost unheard of at the time. Biopsies of her tumor had been taken and were studied by a scientist who regarded them as extremely unusual, with him finding that Henrietta's cells appeared to be nearly immortal. Typical cells of this type would have lived outside of the body for only a matter of days, though hers lasted considerably longer than this, though an exact time frame isn't really known. These cells proved to be extremely valuable due to the fact that they simply wouldn't die. A scientist later on used samples of these cells to develop a vaccine for polio, and in the years since, her cells have been used in thousands of different medical patients and research projects, and are continuing to be used to this day. Her tumor is said to have saved the lives of millions of people, and she has absolutely no idea. A single cancer diagnosis which claimed the life of one patient somehow managed to change modern medicine permanently and prolong the lives of individuals all across the world. Henrietta's story is very seldom told, and most people, even doctors or professionals in the medical field, have no idea who this woman was or what an important role she played in modern medicine. Her story has only recently begun to increase in popularity, and it's such a heartwarming and sobering thought to see that from a woman's tragic death, millions of people almost miraculously have been given a new chapter of life. For anyone who has deeply researched the Titanic, the name Jack Phillips may sound familiar, though for the rest of us, his name is likely as foreign as an unknown language. Jack Phillips was a wireless operator on board the Titanic, which, as we all know, tragically sunk back in 1912 after colliding with an iceberg. Jack and another man named Harold were solely responsible for relaying messages to both the workers and passengers of the ship. It was also their job to receive messages from nearby ships regarding any impending doom or dangerous weather that may be in the ship's path. As soon as the ship struck the iceberg, and it was determined that it would be submerged in just a matter of hours, both Harold and Jack worked all night, sending an almost limitless number of SOS messages to nearby boats and liners. When they were granted no assistance from nearby personnel, the captain declared every man for himself, and many workers abandoned their post and began to attempt to flee the ship. Though Jack remained at his desk, continuing to send out SOS signals, hoping for some sort of assistance from those passing by. Even though his work seemed completely futile, he continued on, trying to save the lives of as many people as he possibly could. Up until the seconds of his passing, he remained at his post, sending signals. It's been said that without his efforts, the RMS Carpathia would never have known the Titanic was in distress. His work saved the lives of at least 705 people, and Jack sadly passed away without ever realizing the impact that his seemingly fruitless efforts left behind. What's extremely strange is that in 2015, Britain launched Major Tim Peake into space, with much of the world regarding him as the country's first astronaut. Though many of these news outlets seem to have forgotten that Helen Sherman, a Briton, had already been sent to space several years earlier. Prior to her involvement in the space program, Helen had worked as a research chemist for a sugar company. Her call to action as an astronaut came completely out of the blue one day, when she was listening to the radio and heard an advertisement stating that astronauts were wanted and no experience was needed. Her life would soon be permanently changed. Helen responded to the ad before Britain even had its own space program. The plan for Helen was to be boarded alongside a Russian in one of their spacecraft. This was allegedly due to previous tensions between the Russian and British governments, and this program was supposedly put in place to show the world that Russia and Britain could in fact work closely together, even after the Cold War. Over 13,000 applicants applied for the astronaut position, but Helen was the lucky one selected for the mission. She passed all of her psychological evaluations, medical assessments, as well as intense training exercises, and she was, by all accounts, Britain's first astronaut, spending 8 days at the space station. Frank Wills is surely a name no one can recall, though he's one of America's most important pieces of history, as he was the night shift security guard for the Watergate building back in 1972. One night on June 17th, Wills was making his standard rounds at the building when he happened to take note of a small piece of paper that had been placed over the top of a lock to the basement door. This was done in such a manner that it would keep the door from locking and allow free access to that part of the building. He removed the paper and continued on, though when he made his rounds again later on, he noticed that the paper had been reapplied. He immediately called police, who arrived and did a full search of the building, sending the place on lockdown and shutting off power to all of the elevators. They eventually found 5 suspects on the 6th floor of the building who had been breaking into the Democratic National Committee rooms. It was then found out that these men were working under direct orders of President Nixon and became accomplices in the Watergate scandal, one of the greatest scandals in American history, which eventually led to Nixon stepping down as president, the only time that this has ever happened in America's over 200 years of existence. If it weren't for Frank Wills, the Watergate scandal would have never come to light, and who knows how American history could have been altered. Frank resigned from his position as a guard shortly after the scandal made national headlines, and he passed away in the year 2000. This creepy urban legend from China, like many other urban legends from around the world, has a few different variations, all of which take place at midnight on November 14th, 1995. As the story goes, bus 375 had left Yuanmingyuan bus station in Beijing, where 3 shadowy men appeared at the side of the road and flagged down the bus. They had extremely pale faces and were wearing high-ranking traditional robes from the Qing dynasty. One man had his head bowed and had long, dark hair covering his face. 2 men were helping him walk. Their unconventional appearance made everyone uncomfortable. Soon, the only passengers were an old woman, a young man behind her, and the mysterious trio in the very back. The old woman began yelling that her purse had been taken and accused the young man. She said there was a police station at the next stop and demanded to be let off. The man, knowing that he did not steal her purse, agreed to let the police determine the true story. Once they got off the bus, the old woman's demeanor changed, and she explained that there was no police station and that she knew her purse had not been stolen by him. She kindly explained that she had just saved their lives. Earlier, she noticed the 3 men had no feet and concluded that they were ghosts. In some versions of the urban legend, the 2 of them went to the police but were laughed out of the station. Days later, bus 375 was found at the bottom of a reservoir 100 kilometers away from Fragrant Hills. Inside were 3 bodies, including the man with long black hair. In the scariest versions of this urban legend, the bodies looked ancient, like they'd been underwater for an eternity. For more than 300 years, a disturbing urban legend has creeped out California. An urban legend originating in the Santa Lucia Mountains during the 1700s. Spanish settlers would tell stories of humanoid creatures that stood 10 feet tall and wore wide-brimmed hats and cloaks. Despite their giant size, they would disappear without a trace into the woods. The settlers called this mysterious phenomenon Los Vigilantes Oscuros, which translates to the Dark Watchers. When Anglo-Americans moved west and settled in the area, stories of the Dark Watchers continued. According to the urban legends, settlers reported an uneasy feeling of being watched that they could not explain. Weird history stories about the Dark Watchers continued to haunt the mountains for hundreds of years. Famous author John Steinbeck, who wrote Of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath, had a mother who would leave out food for the Dark Watchers. Later, she would find the food gone and flowers mysteriously left in its place. This event made an impression on Steinbeck, who would later go on to write about the Dark Watchers in a short story called Flight. One possible explanation for these persistent sightings could be a broken specter, a rare phenomenon in which people's own shadow appears at a distance in the fog. A dark and disturbing urban legend from Georgia's history is mostly true. Since 1956, almost 700 people have lost their lives in Lake Lanier, and 200 of those within the last 30 years. This has led some to believe the urban legend that the lake is cursed. Lake Lanier formed in 1950 after the Chattahoochee River was dammed and the surrounding land was flooded. Land was bought by the government and people were relocated, and this included relocating graveyards. Workers from the Army Corps of Engineers dug up all of the human remains that had a grave marker so that they could be relocated, but many sites were unmarked and missed. The urban legend says that there are at least 2 spirits known to lurk around the waters of Lake Lanier. The first is a shadowy figure on a raft using a pole to navigate. This is despite the fact that the water is 45 feet deep. Stories say the rafter has been seen shouting and jumping into the water before disappearing into thin air. The other spirit is called the Lady of Lake Lanier. In 1957, Delia Mae Parker was riding in the passenger seat of a car, driven by a friend named Susie. The car went off the road while crossing the Lanier Bridge. The only evidence left behind were the tire marks on the road. A search of the water turned up nothing. A year later, a fisherman found a woman's body in the water. The state of the remains was too bad for the woman to be identified, and she had no hands. According to the urban legend, it wasn't long after this that the ghostly figure of a woman without hands was spotted. It wasn't until November of 1990 that the Lady of Lake Lanier was identified. Susie's car was discovered and the remains of the driver were still inside. The ghostly figure was Delia. Of the many lives that were lost in the lake, there were also survivors. If the scary stories are true, then people sometimes later said that they could feel hands trying to pull them down to the bottom of the cursed lake. The Second World War is full of dark history stories, especially those involving scientific experiments and advances. According to urban legends, one such experiment was Project Rainbow, and its goal was to make a ship invisible to the human eye. The USS Eldridge was the subject of these experiments. The first of these experiments took place in July of 1943 in Philadelphia. Witnesses aboard other vessels saw Eldridge's engines kick in, a green glow surrounding the ship before it vanished for a few moments. Another experiment took place in October. The Eldridge again glowed and disappeared. This time, it had been telephoned to Norfolk Naval Shipyard 200 miles away. Again, it was only there for a few seconds before returning to Philadelphia. The experiments had devastating consequences on the sailors aboard the USS Eldridge, a mystery illness that sometimes drove people mad. Bodies were reportedly found fused together with the metal of the ship. According to one version of the urban legend, 2 sailors managed to avoid any serious illness, only to vanish into thin air while back on shore. In 1956, a man named Carl Allen began to share information about the Philadelphia experiment that was later proven to be mostly an urban legend. The Navy has denied the experiment ever took place. With our understanding of physics, the results would be impossible. Logs for the USS Eldridge, which was a real ship, showed that it was never in Philadelphia in 1943 and wasn't even commissioned until August of that year. Carl Allen was also described by his family as a creative and imaginative loner with a history of delusions. The Philadelphia experiment may have been inspired by real experiments designed to hide ships, but the story of Project Rainbow's alleged success, if you can call it that, seems to be nothing more than an urban legend. The state of Vermont has a dark history story that many believed at one point to be mostly true. The urban legend was published in 1887 from a family diary, and the bizarre events supposedly took place 20 miles from the city of Montpelier. The author of these alleged diary entries, known only as Uncle William, claims to have come across a small farming community with an untold story. 6 members of the community had been given medication to knock them out. 5 were elderly, while the other was a disabled man in his 30s. To his amazement, once they were subdued, their families dragged them outside where they were left to freeze. As the urban legend goes, the next morning, the bodies were packed into a box with straw. It was nailed shut to protect from predators and left to be buried in the snow. A woman who was married to one of the frozen men explained to Uncle William to come back on May 10th to see the frozen people resuscitated. Sure enough, a later diary entry tells of William returning on May 10th. The box was dug out of the snow and the bodies were placed in baths made from hemlock logs. Boiling water covered the bodies. Color was added to give the water the shade of wine. After an hour, life returned to the frozen bodies. It began with color in their cheeks, then twitching fingers, and finally a gasp of breath. The previously frozen people were apparently perfectly fine afterwards. For obvious medical reasons, this tale is surely an urban legend, but in the 1800s, such a tale seemed somewhat plausible. And so stories spread of farming communities that would often freeze themselves for the winter when crops ailed, and there was not enough food to survive. Some of the darkest moments of World War II take place in the claustrophobic quarters of a ship at sea. One especially cursed ship is the SS Alkimos, a ship built during the war under the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. If the creepy backstories are true, then this ship was cursed from the beginning. Several workers became trapped and lost their lives in small compartments aboard the ship, as their oxygen ever so slowly ran out. Shortly after its launch in October of 1943, the ship was reassigned and rechristened as Viggo Hanstein for 18 months of war service in the Mediterranean. The story gets creepier in August of 1944, when a Canadian radio operator had her life taken by another member of the crew, who then took his own life. The ship's dark history continued when weird stories of paranormal activity were reported on board, including ghost sightings. It was sold in 1953 to a Greek shipping company that renamed it Alkimos after a Greek god. But the creepy history associated with the Alkimos would eventually claim the ship itself. On March 20th, 1963, the Alkimos struck a reef near Beagle Island on a voyage from Jakarta to Bunbury. It was towed into Fremantle for repairs, but got impounded in May, only to be towed to Hong Kong for more repairs. Unfortunately, the tow line snapped early in the journey, and heavy winds drove it ashore, where the World War II ship was stranded for months of winter storms and left with a caretaker. During this time, the caretaker told stories about how they would hear voices that sent chills down their spine. when the Alkimos was finally towed away in January. The tug was seized by authorities and the Alkimos was left anchored, though the chain eventually broke and the ship drifted away, becoming seriously damaged. The ship was sold for scrap, but repeated fires drove the salvage workers off of the wreck. Oddly enough, the site of the Alkimos remains a popular diving venue today. Jack Su, the Chinese-Australian diver, also known for his service as a Z-Force commando in World War II, even wrote a book entitled Ghost of Alkimos, a collection of creepy anecdotes about the wreck. He claimed to have heard a ghost on the ship when he was in their bunk, a ghost making the sound of someone moaning in their sleep. The shipmates have similar scary stories, including one sighting of a figure dressed in sailor's clothes with blonde hair. The Alkimos may no longer be afloat, but it's disturbing to consider that Perth's famous ghost ship could still be haunted by unexplainable phenomena now, even underwater. Fort Leavenworth was built in the city of Leavenworth, Kansas in 1827. The first settlement in Kansas Territory, it's now the second oldest United States Army post west of Washington, D.C. Its weirdly dark history remains a largely untold story years later. In 1866, Fort Leavenworth was the base of the original Buffalo Soldiers, the nickname used by the Native American tribes to refer to black soldiers in the 10th Cavalry Regiment of the Army. As the Indian Wars slowly petered out, the fort became the home of what would eventually become the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, a graduate school for military training. In the early 20th century, officers like Dwight D. Eisenhower, George S. Patton, and Omar Bradley graduated from the school between the two world wars. 19,000 officers completed courses there during World War II, and the fort even became a National Historic Landmark in 1960. But in addition to the place's obvious historical significance, and its role in training so many soldiers that would go on to fight in World War II, Fort Leavenworth is also the site of some of the creepiest sightings. Many believe the place is one of the most haunted posts in America. Several old houses in the historic fort have been noted for the presence of strange sounds at night. Some paranormal stories suggest the ghost of executed inmates haunt the fort. The general's residence at First Scott Avenue is said to be haunted by General George Armstrong Custer, who'd been seen roaming the first floor. Custer chose to remain at the base because he was court-martialed there in 1867 for the mistreatment of his troops. The rookery at 14 Summer Place is also considered one of the most haunted buildings at the fort, being the oldest on the base. One recurring ghost is that of a woman with long hair who claws at residents with their fingernails. Other paranormal stories include an elderly woman speaking in the corner, an old man with bushy hair, and a young girl screaming. Some suspect the old woman is Mary Pinckney Hardy MacArthur, the mother of General Douglas MacArthur, who played a major role in the Pacific Theater during the history of World War II. Today, Fort Leavenworth is still visited for its haunted houses, but perhaps the scariest part of this story isn't the creepy apparitions seen on the military base, but rather the fort's long, brutal history. Places like this that have experienced intense events over the years are often the site of the most bone-chilling sightings. The Diplomat Hotel in the Philippines was originally built between 1913 and 1915 as a vacation house for American and Spanish friars from the Order of the Preachers, more commonly known as the Dominican Order. But the house, which was built at the top of Dominican Hill, took on more historical significance during World War II. At first, the place became a refuge for people fleeing from the Japanese, until the Imperial Army eventually turned the property into their own headquarters. The secret police used the place for punishing priests, nuns, and refugees, often ending with the removal of their heads. In 1945, American troops liberated the Philippines and destroyed the old site, while the Japanese forces inside took their own lives. In 1973, almost 20 years later, Diplomat Hotels Inc. bought and remodeled the building, finally turning it into a hotel with 133 bedrooms, though architects kept some of the unique features chosen by the original friars. The hotel ceased operations after its manager passed away in 1987. Today, the abandoned building is remembered as a haunted hotel because of its scary history. In recent years, it's become an art center and tourist spot, and has been featured on Philippine news programs, including One at Heart with Jessica Soho. Visitors frequently come to remember the dark history of the place, sometimes hoping to leave with stories of paranormal encounters. Many visitors have claimed to see headless ghosts at night and hear strange noises like screaming, banging on doors, and crying. The building may have been remodeled and used for new purposes, but if the stories are true, then throughout all of history, the spirits of those who did not survive will linger behind those walls. One of the scariest episodes in the dark history of World War II happened following the Battle of Ambon, an event which occurred over the first few days of February of 1942. The Japanese army had attacked the island of Ambon in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and defeated the combined Dutch and Australian troops in a matter of days. The Allied forces didn't lose many people during the course of the battle. However, in the weeks following the surrender, the lives of over 300 Australian and Dutch prisoners of war were taken at random near the Laha airfield and buried in mass graves, an event now known as the Laha Massacre. Some surviving crew from a Japanese minesweeper sunk by a Dutch-laid mine in the Ambon Bay took part, suggesting this scary story was partly motivated by revenge. 3/4 of the captured Australians of Ambon lost their lives before the end of the war, and most survivors who remained on the island passed away soon after World War II. In 1946, one of the largest war crime trials took place, relating to the Laha Massacre, as 93 Japanese soldiers were tried by an Australian military tribunal. One of the men was Commander Kunido Hatakayama, who was in command of the massacres, though he did not order them himself. He, like so many other high-ranking servicemen, was sentenced to capital punishment, and the rest were imprisoned. During the war, American propaganda in the media reached an all-time high. Some of the most dark and disturbing propaganda stories were aimed at the Japanese. Media often described them as yellow vermin, and an official US Navy film called them living snarling rats. Such thinking especially took off in the wake of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. These stories, intended to dehumanize the Japanese, were effective to a scary degree. Expert historians know from first-hand accounts by American servicemen that troops often made a habit of taking trophies from the bodies of Imperial Japanese soldiers. These morbid souvenirs often included teeth, ears, noses, and other parts. In some of the darkest moments of the war, the most common and scariest trophies were entire heads, which were boiled down to leave only a grinning visage beneath. These heads were regarded as treasures, each with their own secret horror story hidden within. It was not uncommon to find World War II bases covered with such dreadful decor. They were even mailed home to family with the cavalier attitude of a hunter showing off the antlers of a buck. In one of the weirdest and darkest moments of World War II history, on June 13, 1944, Francis E. Walter, a U.S. representative at the time, gifted President Franklin Roosevelt a letter opener fashioned from the bony remains of a Japanese soldier's arm. Roosevelt accepted the strange gift, supposedly commenting, "This is the sort of gift I like to get." This strange but true history story led to outrage in both Japan and the U.S. civilian population, and several weeks later, Roosevelt ordered his letter opener to be given a proper burial. In fact, the taking of trophies had become such a problem that in September of 1942, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet warned that any American troops who continued to use part of the enemy's body as a souvenir would face stern disciplinary action, This was only loosely enforced, however, and the startling practice remained for years afterward. This weird history chapter would largely come to an end after most of the trophies were returned to Japan, but the search still continued many years later, and some remains have still never been recovered. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys